Please stand by. Good day and welcome to today's Informed Consent Seminar. All lines will be in a listen-only mode for the duration of today's call. To ask a question, please press *1 at any time to be placed into the queue. If you need technical assistance during the conference, please press *0. As a reminder, today's call is being recorded. I would now like to turn things over to Liz Buttrey, who will be facilitating today's seminar.
Welcome, everybody, to today's Informed Consent Seminar. I want to introduce Lynn, Kunkel, and Jennifer Sharpe-Potter, who have agreed to present the presentation for you today. Let's go ahead and get started with an introduction. The seminar is intended to assist CTN-affiliated research staff understand the principles of informed consent in research trials. We wanted to start off by getting a little bit of the demographic information from you guys, so I'm going to scoot over to some polling. It also serves the purpose of letting everybody get a little comfortable with polling, which we will be doing after each module of the training. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the first poll. What is your current position title? So if everybody would take a moment just to go ahead and indicate what your title is right now.
Liz, it says that the polls are closed.
Yeah, let me open those up. There you go. That's much easier. Okay, it looks like we've got a lot of research assistants today.
I think that's about all we're going to get.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, let's scoot on to the next one. What is your level of experience in clinical trials? Great. It looks like we have about 46% with less than a year, so this will be very helpful for you guys. Wonderful. Let's drop on to the next polling question. What is your level of experience in obtaining informed consent? Great, Jen and Lynn, it looks like you got 50% with less than a year, 23% with about 2 to 3 years, 11% with 4 to 5 years, and 11% with more than 6 years. All right, our final question for the introduction is, did you receive formal training on informed consent? Great. All right, what I'm going to do, I'll go back to the presentation, and I will turn it on over to you, Jen.
Lynn, I think you were going to start with a couple things. Is that right?
Yeah, sure. My name is Lynn Kunkel, and I'm from the Oregon-Hawaii node. I'm the node coordinator, as well as doing other things. And we are here today to talk about the informed consent process. Jen will introduce herself in a second as well. Well, one thing that we would like is, although it's a little bit awkward, we would appreciate any feedback that you guys have or comments that you want to make during the process or any insight that you have from your experience. We really would like this to be some sort of a dialogue, and so we can all learn from each other, because we've all had vast experience and different experience in informed consent processing. In order to do that, though, you'll have to do *1 in order to be able to talk. And I know that's a little bit awkward, but we would appreciate that. Any feedback you have. You can also ask questions. Along the top dialog, there's a Q&A, and you can pull that down and ask a question, and we will get to that as soon as we can as well. So it looks like we mostly have RAs, as Liz mentioned, and we've got the majority of people having less than 1 year experience. Is my voice doing okay?
Actually, Lynn, this is Jennifer. I'm just going to give you some feedback. It's a little distorted.
Okay.
I think over the course of 2 hours it's going to...
Okay. I'll try not to move so much. I'm a little fidgety, so does that help if I don't move?
That's a lot better.
Okay. So please provide that feedback, too, if the voices aren't, or if they're annoying. I can't do that too much about that, but if it's distorted or whatnot. So years of clinical experience, we've got about 45% of the people having less than a year, and then there's a 35% that have 6 years or more. And then formal training, interesting enough, the results came out to be about 55% of the people said that they had formal training, 44% of course saying that they have not had formal training. So it's a pretty evenly distributed amount there. So Jen, do you want to take from here?
Sure. And as Lynn mentioned, my name is Jennifer Potter. I know some of you on the call, but not all of you. I'm an investigator with the Northern New England node based at McLean Hospital, and I'm a clinical psychologist by training. Okay. So what we want to do in this first part is provide a little bit of context. And the idea behind this is at the end of the training, we really do hope that everyone leaving appreciates that informed consent is a process. Occasionally, it can take on the role of this piece of paper that needs to get signed. But when we look at it in its historical context and the important role it plays in doing ethical, appropriate research and taking care of our human participants, it really starts to become much more of a process and a pretty important part of the research that we do. So what we'll do is we'll go through some of the underpinnings of it and go from there. Okay. So when we think about the informed consent process, what we're talking about is that informed consent is an exchange of information, and it's between someone who's interested in participating in a trial and the investigator and other study staff. So everyone here who's involved in clinical research is an active participant in informed consent. Informed consent is a dynamic process that goes on before, during, and sometimes after the study. And if we think about the reasons why that is that someone comes to us interested either because of a radio ad or they've been approached in a clinic, and they want to know information, and we want to make sure that they have all the information. So it's a dialogue that goes on as we're doing that. It's also important to keep people aware of what they'd agreed to do when they're participating, even during a trial. So this is, for example, remember in the informed consent, we talked about some of the side effects that this medication might have. And then even after a study, if someone comes back, we've made commitments to them in our informed consent, something as simple as an unblinding process. If we've committed to let people know in a placebo-controlled trial, for example, what their randomization assignment was, that's a continuing part of this informed consent process. And every piece of that information is important because of that commitment we've made to honor this informed consent. What the informed consent process does is it is an opportunity to build trust and rapport with participants. It allows for participants to truly understand and become fully informed about the study, all the risks and the benefits, the pros and the cons, so that they can make an informed decision. It provides a time for the participant to ask questions about the study, any of the study procedures, what's going to happen to them, more about the medication or the intervention that they might be receiving in a clinical trial. And another part of informed consent is making sure that the participant understands what they're agreeing to do. So it's more than just them saying, yes, yes, I want to do this, I want to do this. It's really making sure that they adequately understand what they've committed to do. So the onus is on us to ensure their understanding, not just to take that for granted. Of course, one very big part of informed consent is that document, that how many pieces of paper, pages that our various consent forms are. I know at McLean Hospital they sometimes get up to be 18 pages, which is a very long consent form. But this important document that people review, understand, and sign. The document needs to contain some key elements that we'll be discussing today. But this informed consent document provides all information needed for the participant to make an informed decision. And that's really up to the IRB and the investigators to make sure that it contains all the information needed for that participant's decision-making process. It also can be used as a guide for a verbal study explanation. So in some of the trials that you're working on, you may even use the informed consent and walk through the various sections so that you can have a conversation with the potential participants about the study. So it's a great guide to walk through all of the key elements you're going to need to discuss and ensure that the participant understands. Informed consent is a process that has regulatory oversight for federally funded trials as well as other trials. It's interesting, for the projects that we're involved with, depending on the nature of the project, it's going to have oversight by different entities. The Office of Human Research Protections works under something called the Code of Federal Regulations, which is a very large, it's the laws of the country, essentially. But the Code of Federal Regulations, and people who get more into this and go on to work in regulatory work knows this very well. Lynn, I'm sure you can cite this chapter and verse, but it's 45 CFR 46. But then there's another regulatory body, the Food and Drug Administration, that's the FDA, and their regulation is via a different part of the Code of Federal Regulations, 21 CFR 50. So the important part of this is that we have regulatory oversight. We have commitments that we make when we obtain federal research dollars to honor what's described in the Code of Federal Regulations about informed consent. And as we'll see in the next couple of moments, there's a reason why these regulations exist, why they've been developed, and why it's a dynamic and evolving process about how we handle informed consent issues in clinical research. There's a lot of overlap between FDA and OHRP regulations, but they're not completely overlapping. So sometimes different parts of them are applied differently. So it's important to know which study, what regulatory body your study has being monitored by. Sorry, I'm stumbling through this a bit. But so, for example, if you have an investigational new drug, the FDA has oversight over that activity because you have to file with the FDA to work on this investigational new drug. OHRP is more historically covers NIH research or DHHS research, and that's the Department of Health and Human Services and the National Institutes of Health. And so all of our work that's federally funded within the CTN has OHRP oversight, and sometimes we'll also have FDA oversight.
Jennifer, if I could just say one sentence so that doesn't get overwhelming to the people, like, oh my God, what all regulations do I have to follow?
Reduce that down for me, Lynn.
What?
Just go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, I was going to say that you can work closely with your IRB, and they will be able to provide you with which regulations are necessary and not, and what to follow and so forth. So they can really be a resource for you as far as, is this an FDA, is this OHRP, what kind of oversight am I concerned about here?
Yeah, and I think the takeaway point isn't that you remember the numbers or anything about the Code of Federal Regulations in particular, but I think what's essential is that these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. They're ethical principles, but they're also regulatory guidelines that are monitored by the federal government. So, we need to obey the laws and the regulations for the money that we receive to conduct our research. So this is pretty serious stuff, and informed consent, as you'll see as we get into some of the examples, it takes on a huge importance. And there are responsibilities that we have not only to our participants, but to our funding agencies to honor these principles, as well as our own internal institutional and personal ethics. Okay, the other entities that are important are the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and the institutions at which the studies are being conducted. And one important thing to note is that while a given IRB and a given institution may have more stringent standards than federal regulations, they certainly cannot have more lenient standards. So what we often see is that there's a lot of variability with these, but that IRB variability is not because any are more lenient than the federal regulations, it's because some are perhaps more stringent or are interpreting federal regulations slightly differently. Okay, and again, I know Lynn mentioned this earlier, but if I'm not explaining anything clearly or someone wants to make a comment, please jump in. We're happy to field questions as we go throughout.
Again, just as a reminder to everybody, to ask a question, you press *0.
Thank you, Liz.
You're welcome.
And pardon the interruption, this is the operator. That is *1 to ask a question.
I'm sorry, yeah,
That's okay.
thank you.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about some of the basic idea behind informed consent, and when we were talking about this, we thought it was pretty important to understand some of the historical milestones that have occurred. And I'm assuming that everyone has been exposed at least to some extent to this because of the training that they've received at their institutions in good clinical practice. So we won't go into a lot of detail with this, but we will use it to demarcate some significant events that happened and that led to how we do informed consent today. So the three events that we wanted to highlight that had a significant impact on the Code of the Federal Regulations are the Nuremberg War Crimes trials, the thalidomide tragedy, and the Tuskegee syphilis study. And as is noted here, there are many more. Okay. So obviously, if we look at the dates of 1940, we know that this was right around World War II or post-World War II, and as part of a lot of criminal court activity that was done after did I say Vietnam or World War II? I think I just said Vietnam War. The World War II. Some of the work that was done in Germany in the prisoner of war camps and the concentration camps was medical research, and the medical research that was done was exposed following the war. At that time, it became clear that in addition to the many atrocities that had gone on, there were research atrocities that had gone on, and there's a countless number of studies that we could talk about that were pretty horrific. And so what happened is that if we take away the issues that were highlighted by it, the issue of people agreeing to be participants in the research that conducted was one of the key highlights. So just going through some of the things that came out of the Nuremberg War Crimes trial was that there needed to be volunteer informed consent without coercion, that human experiments needed to be based on prior animal experimentation. And the idea behind this is that you can't just go to a human participant and start doing things that don't have a scientific basis for what you're doing. You need to have a scientific methodology behind it, and often that starts with animal research. That anticipated scientific results should justify the experiment, and that only qualified scientists should conduct medical research. That when we're conducting our scientific research, we need to avoid physical and mental suffering whenever possible, and that there could be no expectation or death of disabling injury. In other words, that the benefits of the research needed to outweigh the risks. And out of Nuremberg came some basic agreement on international standards for the conduct of research. Lynn, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I guess the one thing that it says is that this was kind of the ethical yardstick for whether or not what you were doing was ethical or not. And it was, again, an international kind of outplay of what had happened in the war crimes. So, that's it.
But people were starting to recognize that science was evolving very rapidly. And what became clear after the Nuremberg War Crimes trials was that we needed to have some common sense of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate when we're conducting scientific research. So it's the beginning of our contemporary ethical standards. Another event happened, and it actually affected people in Europe and Canada more directly, but there is a product called thalidomide. It's actually still available. I was looking it up today. It's used for certain types of treatments. But thalidomide was a drug that was used to treat sleep disorders, but primarily morning sickness in pregnant women. And so the drug was prescribed and used in Europe and in Canada. It was approved by their local federal agencies. And what became clear after babies were born from these women was that the drug was obviously extremely dangerous, and unfortunately the example in that photograph there is a child that was born whose mother had been taking thalidomide during the first trimester. And what would happen was that it resulted in these rather severe abnormalities. So the critical piece of this is that for some people, they weren't, in the United States, people who took this and were impacted by it, they were not informed that they had been taking an experimental drug, nor had they been asked their consent. And the end result of this was that in 1962, there was the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act amendment requiring written consent documentation. So this is really where we begin this issue about informed consent in the more contemporary way that we view it, is that you can't just have a conversation and tell people about the risks and benefits. You can't just describe to them the research. You need to have some documentation that conversation has occurred and what the conversation entails. And then finally, the Tuskegee syphilis study, and again, this is something that I'm sure many of you have seen at least something about. There was it was a very good play written about it in Miss Evers' voice. But the Tuskegee syphilis study, so this was a naturalistic study. The idea behind this was that prior to our awareness of any treatments for syphilis, they wanted to understand how syphilis acted on the body. So these individuals were identified as having syphilis, and they were followed over time. The participants were predominantly, versus all African Americans, from the South, relatively poor and uneducated, and they participated in this study. There was no requirement to give consent, and they were not aware of the diagnosis that they had or what was happening to them. What became even more disturbing about this was this study continued, and these individuals were left untreated for their syphilis even after treatments became available for the syphilis, and they were essentially deprived of treatment. This, when this came to light, led to something that Lynn's actually going to talk a little bit more about later, called the Belmont Report, and the establishment of the National Human Investigation Board and Institutional Review Board for institutions. And these have evolved into what are modern-day institutional review boards and federally driven human subject boards have resulted from. So this is the Belmont Report, and this was a guideline document outlining basic ethical principles to conducting research and guidelines for the protection of human subjects, and developed the federal regulations of subject protection in this concept of beneficence, respect for persons, and justice that we'll go over a little bit more. And I think one of the interesting things about this is that a lot of these are historical, and they're useful to understand the history of why we are where we are today, why we monitor so carefully our research studies, and how our ethical principles have evolved over time. But I think the danger in this is because they happened a relatively long time ago, is that we can forget how important informed consent issues are even today. And there is an example that I wanted to mention just briefly that's not in the slides, which is, again, some of you may have seen this or may have received information about this, but it's the story of Ellen Roche, who was an employee at a major research institution. She was 24 years old, and she was a healthy volunteer. And she volunteered for a study of a substance called hexamethonium, and the idea was to look at it was an asthma study, and they wanted to understand normal breathing processes and how people would respond to inhaling this particular agent. And unfortunately, she died. And the investigation of her death, I think, really highlights some of the issues that can still happen today and why it is so critical for us to be vigilant about the way we conduct our research and informed consent. And there was a federal investigation of this particular, and if people are interested, you can pop me an email and I'll send you some articles about it. But when the federal investigation was conducted, and this occurred in this century, so in sometime in 2000, I think it was, or 2001, that the federal investigation found that the study had not been reviewed properly at the IRB meeting, and that the volunteers, these are healthy volunteers, so these people were not sick at all, were not warned of the risks of participating, and that the informed consent document referred to this agent, hexamethonium, as a medication. It didn't say it was an investigational drug or an investigational substance. It was referred to specifically in the language of the consent form as a medication, and did not mention the fact that hexamethonium used by inhalation was experimental. In fact, hexamethonium was withdrawn from human use by the Food and Drug Administration in the 1970s and had never been approved by the FDA for administration via inhalation. And I think the reason why I wanted to highlight this is it specifically points to the importance of informed consent. When we use words like medication, when we don't talk about the risks of a drug, when we don't explain that it's investigational, that's misleading because it wasn't a medication. And so the language that we use in our informed consent is important, and that's why when you get back an informed consent document from your IRB and they've asked you to change something, they're looking for very precise wording, and they're trying to honor and respect the principles that we're going to be going through today. So I just wanted to mention Ellen Roche because I think for many people who followed her story, it highlights why we need to be very vigilant to this even now, because ethics is an evolving process. People make mistakes. We do miss things occasionally, so it's our responsibility for all of us to monitor these things regularly.
Jennifer, if I can add, this is Lynn. I took my headset off, so if you can't hear me, tell me. We talk about how it's important to follow the ethics and the guidelines and the regulations and so forth, but it also comes down to society hears about these, across the newspaper, healthy patient dies in clinical trial, and it really puts a black mark on research at large. And so it's important also to have successful research, have people be able to have a very positive attitude towards research, understand the importance of it in advancing medicine, advancing treatments, and so forth, and be able to trust the research community at large. And that trust really comes about in this informed consent process. This is what I'm going to do, this is what you're going to do, this is you are fully informed about what the study is, and each positive experience that a participant has makes society view research so much better, which really helps us all move forward in an ethical way, in a responsible way, and really helps medicine be able to get the evidence-based practices and all the things that we're trying to get to. So it really does come around. And then, when we start talking about all of us are under the pressure of getting the numbers and stuff like that, it really does affect that too. Because if society views research better, we're more likely to have people that will volunteer for research.
Yeah, Lynn, you reminded me with that of when I started doing clinical research. This was in the 90s? Yeah, the 90s, early 90s. And I was working in Georgia, and I was doing HIV prevention work. And we were recruiting for a trial of an HIV preventive intervention. And people had said to me, you're going to need to be careful because many people in the communities that you're recruiting from believe that the government infected African Americans with AIDS. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. I can't imagine somebody thinking that. And I think that came out of my own naivete about the impact of some of these atrocities on people's lives and what they hear and understand. And it reminds me of what you're saying, because when I was doing the work and when we were recruiting people, this did come up, and it's an issue that people really did feel that based on Tuskegee, which did happen in the South, and in Tuskegee, Alabama, and I was in Atlanta, Georgia. People have a lot of mistrust. It's not everybody, certainly, but when your community is negatively impacted by research, it has an impact and it has repercussions. So it's very important to pay attention to this stuff. It also, Lynn, points out something that you and I were talking about with Liz that we wanted to make sure that, and we can certainly come back to this, is no matter how important recruitment is in a trial, no matter how important it is to get subjects staying in a study, our ethical principles need to be maintained, and we need to be vigilant against crossing that line into coerciveness or manipulation. And we may not always do that intentionally, but we really need to be vigilant about it. So we can talk more about that as well. So we were going to just finish this section with some polling questions and see what people's thoughts were about some questions. So, Liz, do you want to take that on?
Sure, Jen. Let's go ahead to the first lesson polling question number 1. Informed consent is it a document and a process by which a person agrees to participate in research study after being fully informed? Is it a contract, or is it a release of clinic responsibility? Okay.
I think that was probably everyone.
Yeah, looks like we've got everybody on the mark. Jen, you want to speak to the response of a contract?
Yeah, I guess I think that's an understandable response to think of it as a contract, but it actually, that's not the way we like to think about it. We really do like to think about it as a documented process which a person agrees to participate in. A contract takes it into more of a legalese area. Are we going to go through all of these and then go through the answers? Liz,
Yeah,
I
we
think
will
that's
go
what
through
we had agreed to do.
Okay, we can do that. We'll roll to the next poll. All CTN members are responsible for ensuring the process of obtaining informed consent from research participants, making sure that it respects participant rights to make a voluntary and informed decision and conforms with federal, state, and local regulations. Okay. Jennifer, you ready to go back to the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay. We'll go ahead and we'll review the responses, answers. Jen?
Okay. Oh, obviously the answer is the first one, and we talked a little bit about this. It's not a contract, and it's not a release of clinical responsibility. It's really that first point. Liz, were you thinking of more discussion on that?
Just that participation is voluntary at all times.
Something that we frequently have, I find in our case, we will often have to remind people is that, the point at which they want to stop is the point at which they want to stop. And we don't really have the right to sort of treat it as if it is a contract, because it's not. It's a document that describes some procedures at the time when they read it that they agreed to sign based on their understanding of the study. And it is voluntary, and people can stop at any time. And as much as we want people to participate, this goes back to that fine line issue, is that at the moment they decide to stop is the moment that they've decided to stop, and that's not up to us. I think what then needs to happen is that we need to make sure that we can advise them that what's medically appropriate at the time and what's safe for them, but they don't have to participate in the study at all if that's the decision that they've made.
Jennifer, can I make another point with that, too? It is an understanding also between the researchers and the participant about what is expected. It lays out about the medication or the intervention or whatever it is, but it kind of says, okay, this is the study we're doing at large. This is why we're doing the study. This is the risks of doing the study. This is what we're going to ask of you. We're going to ask you to come back. We're going to ask you to give blood. We're going to ask you to answer these questions, so forth. This is what I'm going to do. I am going to respect your voluntariness, meaning that if you want to withdraw at any time, you can. I'm going to respect your confidentiality by holding the records this way, not putting your name with the information. I'm going to respect the liability associated with it, so forth. So it is a real understanding between this is what I'm going to do, this is what you're going to do. It's a process that we're going to continue to check in with each other to make sure that we understand. If anything changes, that's why if anything with the study changes, we have to go back and get a new consent form, because the agreement that we came up with to begin with has now altered. Either I'm going to call you more often and ask you to come in, or now we're going to do blood 3 times instead of 2 times and so forth. So it is a document, it is a process, but it's a give and take between the researchers and the participants.
Okay, so let's go to the next one. I'm just going to repeat this because this is, I think, the pretty critical to our discussion today, is that all CTN members, all of us, have a responsibility to ensure that the process of obtaining informed consent from research participants respects the participants' right to make a voluntary and informed decision and conforms to federal, state, and local regulations. So there's a lot in this, but it's just critical to what we're doing. Before anything else, we've done a lot of these trainings. These issues are the foundation upon which all of the research that we do and everything else that we do. Lynn and I did a recruitment and retention workshop several weeks ago now, and it's all rooted in ethical conduct in the way that we do our research, and that's every member of the study. So if we think back to Ellen Roche and the individuals that were working on that study, that's not just the responsibility of the principal investigator in that case. If there were people working on that project that had an opportunity that identified a problem, it's their responsibility as well to ensure that our research is conducted in accordance with ethical practice. Okay, so why don't we go on to lesson 2, and I'm going to hand it off to Lynn.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the Common Rule and the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report, of course, is, I got to do the computer too, don't I? The Belmont Report, as Jennifer said, there was a lot of research in the past that led to a development of the Belmont Report, which is the ethical research principles. And there are basically 3 principles of it: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. With the respect for persons, it's basically saying that the information needed to make an informed decision that each individual is going to make about whether or not they want to participate in this study is present and available for the person to obtain that information, to understand that information, to ask questions about that information. It also is, as it implies, respects the person's autonomy and protect those with diminished autonomy. One of the big principles of this is to protect possible vulnerable populations, such vulnerable that might have limited autonomy. Such examples are prisoners or children, or subordinate individuals such as employees or students, people that they feel like they have to participate because their boss is telling them that they have to. Or, of course, the decisionally impaired, and so those individuals that can't make an informed decision about whether they should participate or not, or whether it's in the best interest. And the element of respect for persons is really found in the informed consent process, which we're talking very much about. The second element of the Belmont Report is beneficence, and this is basically the do no harm, that the risk does not outweigh the benefits. The benefits do not outweigh the risks, sorry about that, of participation. And it's respecting the decisions of the people, allowing them to understand what's happening, and making efforts to secure their well-being in the study, that you're not going to put them at harm, that you're not going to do something that is going to outwardly hurt themselves, either physically, mentally, or so forth. The third is justice, which is based on the selection of subjects, what subjects are being enrolled in the study. So you don't want to overly burden one population over the other. Let's say you want to go out and look at a certain subject population. You don't want to take those that are vulnerable or that are, you don't want to overburden the population. You want to make sure that it's generalizable. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Whoops, wrong way. Out of that came the Common Rule. About 17 federal agencies got together, this is federal agencies in the United States, and said, you know what, we need to come up with a quote-unquote common rule about what kind of research needs to be conducted that is federally funded. And they came out with 3 main protective mechanisms to research that has federal funding associated. One of which is the independent IRB review of research, and Jennifer's talked a little bit about that. The institutional assurances of compliance, and the informed consent of participants. So, the independent IRB review. So, each IRB, as Jennifer mentioned, is charged with looking at research to determine whether the benefits outweigh the risks, the people are protected as they should be, all the information is written out there in a lay language approach that people can understand and appreciate what really they're getting into. With each institution that does research, they have to apply for a federal assurance, and right now it's called the federal-wide assurance. And it basically says that we recognize that we're going to get federal funds for participating in this research, and we recognize and we will follow the Belmont Report, the Common Rule, and all such federal guidelines associated with research. One of those guidelines, again, being that any research that they participate in will be IRB approved. And all IRBs have federal-wide assurances. Almost all institutions have them that do research at a general scheme. Oh, wow, that was quick. We have copies of the Common Rule and the Belmont Report that we can share with you. I'm sure that you guys all have copies of them as well. And again, this is just a general guideline for what kind of research should be conducted. Does anybody have any questions about the Common Rule or the Belmont Report?
As a reminder, to ask a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad.
Thanks, Karen. Jennifer, is there anything you want to add about that? I don't think you have to press *1, Jennifer.
I think Jen's okay. You want to go ahead with the polling questions?
Sure.
Okay, the 3 ethical principles of research are beneficence, justice, and respect for persons, justice, comprehension, and autonomy, information comprehension, and voluntariness. Wonderful. Okay, Lynn, you ready to go back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do we have another question, or is that the last question?
We only had one question for that section.
Okay, so everyone got that correct. Very good. You're all paying attention. That the answer is beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. So those are the 3 ethical principles of research. All right. So then the next lesson we're going to go into is we're going to talk about, we've talked a lot about why informed consent is important, how it came about with the federal regulations, and how the progression of research and history came into the federal guidelines for how we conduct it. And now we're going to talk about the document itself and what it summarizes and the different elements it requires. So the requirement elements, as we talked about before, is respect for persons, and this is an information aspect. These are such as the rules of the road, as the slide indicates. And so the respect for persons comes in 3 avenues: information that's provided, comprehensibility, meaning that people can understand it with varying levels of education, and you don't have to have a medical dictionary book sitting next to you. And of course, the voluntary participation, meaning that this is your choice whether or not you want to participate. And Jennifer mentioned 45 CFR earlier and 46 and so forth, and that's all referenced down there at the bottom. This is where these principles come from. So the required elements in the actual written informed consent document. There are 8 required elements. The first one is you have to say what it is that you're doing, the research statement, the purpose, how long it's going to last, what exactly is going to happen during the things, what the expectations are, whether it's experimental, how many people in the country are going to be doing this. So, and you want to say at day 1 you're going to be doing this activity, at day 2 you're going to be doing this activity. Remember, we talked about how it's a real understanding of procedures and what's expected. And this is where in the research statement and the procedures of the consent form you can really tell what all this is going to take place. You also want to talk about the risks and discomforts, because with every research there's going to be some sort of risk. You might be embarrassed. People might see you come into the treatment center and say, I wonder why that person is coming into the treatment center. You might feel uncomfortable. You might get bruising with the blood draws. You might, with some of the buprenorphine studies, when we're getting people into when we're taking the withdrawal, they might feel uncomfortable at first, and so we want to talk about those kind of things. You might get sick to your stomach, and so they know what to expect as far as the risks of their participating. You want to talk about the benefits of participating, and a lot of times the benefit is just, hey, so we could learn more about this condition or about this drug, and so you want to be very clear about what they will get out of it. In addition to that, you want to be very clear about whether, if you're compensating them, you want to say what you're compensating. We'll give you a $40 gift card, or if there's any other sort of benefit for them participating. Usually it's always altruistic, but there are other benefits as well. You also want to state what the alternatives are, and you really want to say this is voluntary. You don't have to participate. It's not going to affect your treatment at whatever agency you're in. You want to say that you can go and do your regular treatment at CODA, for instance. You can do whatever. you want to talk about confidentiality, and confidentiality is one thing that is very close to all of our hearts, I think. We want to respect the individuals that are taking their time out, that are really going that extra step for us and for the advancement of science. And as such, you want to really make them feel secure and understand what is happening with the information that they're providing. Are the documents going to be locked in a room where everybody has access, or is it only going to be at a place that's locked away that there's 3 keys that you have to get into? You want to talk about if there's names going to be associated. And a lot of times there are, since this is a lot of the times we do confidential work instead of anonymous work, is that there is a link somewhere. Anonymous is like filling out a survey without any identifying information at all. Confidential means that we could probably put you together, your name and your data together, although these are the safeguards that we're going to do so your confidentiality is upheld. There's always a liability statement in the consent form, and this is actually, ironically, I know our IRB at OHSU requires all consent forms to be at 8th grade reading level. But this is the legal language that comes in that always bumps up the readability, which always causes confusion. But this is what you want to say, whether or not whether or not the institution will reimburse somebody if they're hurt or injured during the process. If that is the case, to what extent will be reimbursed? Who do we get in touch with if there is a problem? So you want to put your IRB. Institutions usually require that you put contacts for the university themselves. It's kind of the safeguard so people know that there is a net if there is a problem, although we don't usually anticipate them, but there is. And there's legal language. A lot of times, again, we don't write this. Then you've got the contact for questions. Who do we contact if we have questions? I know that most of the RAs provide contact information themselves as far as, call me anytime, so forth. But over and above that, because sometimes they don't want to call the RA. They feel like they want to know more about, the IRB that's reviewing the study or who's in charge and so forth. And so you need to make sure that you provide that information. And then again, you need to state in the consent form that your participation is voluntary and that you can withdraw at any given time and that you don't, once you sign the consent form, it is not a contract that you're stuck with forever. You can talk about that you can withdraw, and you can also say, you know what, I'm not comfortable answering that question. I want to be in the study, but I don't want to answer that question.
Lynn, this is Jennifer. Can we pop back to that other slide for just 1 second?
You betcha. Did you have a comment about it?
Yeah, I think
your mic might be outweighing my voice. When we look at this stuff, a lot of things are interesting about doing this type of training because, I'm sure if all of you go back to the consent forms that you're working with, you will either by these exact titles or some other title find all of these elements in your consent forms because we work in structures that know the regulations and know the ethical principles, and they put this in. What your institution can't do, that all of us have a responsibility to do, is to make sure, go back to the elements of informed consent, that these aren't just written down, but that they're understood. Informed consent is not the time to minimize risks. When you're explaining things to people, it's not the time to overemphasize benefits. There's a lot of information, and for people to truly have experienced an informed consent process, they need to understand all the good and all the bad. And each of us needs to think about our own individual discomfort sharing information. For some of us, it can be difficult to talk about the bad things for a lot of different reasons. One is because it might make us feel uncomfortable. We worry we might offend the person, or we feel a lot of pressure to recruit people, and we've lost 3 people who don't want to consent because occasionally people do not want to sign an informed consent, and that's completely appropriate. You've got to look inside your own stuff and understand where you feel more and less comfortable. So I'll give you an example. In most consent forms, there's a section about reporting and mandatory reporting for certain information, and the most common thing is if there's any evidence of child abuse or neglect. And that's a difficult thing for some people, especially when you're new and you haven't talked about issues like that. Perhaps we're worried we might offend the person if we even bring up the issue of reporting. But boy, I would so much rather, as an investigator, have a person understand, particularly when we're talking about people who abuse substances, the risks of them being in a situation where we might be mandated to report them than to have to go into a room with someone who didn't understand that up front and tell them that we're going to be reporting them to social services. So the connection I'm trying to make here is, yeah, we know all these elements are here, but we really need to understand if we have any discomforts conveying these elements to people. So I hope that makes sense, but it's the way that this stuff becomes active for all of us rather than just sort of a passive process. Because we know that we're going to find these things in our consent forms. What we do with them is a different thing. Thanks, Lynn.
Which actually brings about a thing that Liz and Jen and I talked about when we were preparing this. And it talks about the whole level of what happens if somebody reads you hand them the consent form, say, hey, I need you to read this. And 10 seconds later, they just, they flip the pages over and they sign at the back and they hand it back to you. I mean, what do you do with that kind of situation? A lot of us do that when we go to the medical, when we go see our PCPs and so forth. We're just like, yeah, whatever. But in those kind of instances, it's really important to kind of just take a second and say, I just want to make sure that you know what you're getting into, and kind of verbally go through and not read the consent form, but kind of have a conversation, because that person clearly is not interested in reading the contents of it. But it's really important as the researcher, that you're agreeing with this person, that they understand what's happening, and that you just take a couple of minutes and say, I want you to know that this is an experimental drug. I want you to know that these might be the risks. I want you to know this is what's going to happen with your records and so forth. And just take those extra couple of minutes to step back, acknowledge, you don't have to say, I see you don't want to read it, but acknowledge that that's not their approach of doing things, and just kind of verbally talk with them about it. A lot of times IRBs or institutions will require a quiz at the end, but not all do. And sometimes the quiz are very easy, like, I know my participation is voluntary, and, I know I'll be in it for 6 months and stuff like that. But there might be other important elements. As Jennifer said, check in with your own stuff and think about what you would want to know getting into something that you're going to be taking an experimental drug, or that you're going to be doing an intervention or something. And just take those couple of minutes to just check in with them and make sure that they understand. As well as people that, when they're signing the consent and looking over it, kind of be in tune with them about whether they understand what's happening, or whether they kind of glaze over and aren't paying any attention, or whether they can actually read it. Some people come in and their ability to read is not what we expected, or what ours are, and so we have to be sensitive to those issues too. So when you're obtaining consent, it's not just signing a form, it's really making sure that everybody understands what's happening.
And at the end of that process, if your gut tells you the person didn't get it, or that you don't feel comfortable with this informed consent process, the best thing you can do is talk to your coordinator or your PI, whomever is the appropriate person that you report to, and just touch base with them. They've been through this a lot, most of them, and it's a good idea. Throughout this process, and anytime there's an ethical situation, it's really important not to act in a vacuum, and to use the people on your research team to ask questions, evaluate it, and get that second opinion, because often they have other insights, and everything usually is just fine and they can go ahead with the study. But if your gut's telling you there's something off, you should use that and learn from it and talk to your team.
Yeah, and it's really going to pay off, not just in the sense of somebody's not going to come back to you and say to you, well, did you consent them? But it's also going to make it so they understand that they need to come back in 3 months. They understand what the expectations are. They know what and therefore you'll have better recruitment, you'll have better retention. I mean, it really does, it all comes together as a full package. You'll have better rapport with the person, because they'll feel like they'll be able to trust you because you have shown that you care, that they know what's going on in the study and what's expected of them. So obtaining appropriate informed consent and keeping that dialogue open is fundamental to the successful, not just the ethics part, but the successful implementation of research at large. A lot of times there are, as I think I probably mentioned some of this when I was talking about, there are additional elements that are required. Unforeseeable risks. There's usually in a consent form, and there may be other risks that we're not aware of at this time, but we will keep you informed if we discover them at the time. There's some sort of liability kind of question like that. You want to say that the investigator might stop the study. So not only can the participant withdraw if they want, but the investigator might. Let's go down and they decide, after you've consented them, enrolled them, you discover, you know what, this person is not the best fit for this person to participate in the study for whatever reason. And so the investigator might at that time say, you know what, we appreciate your time, we appreciate your enthusiasm about the research, but we don't think this is going to work. The sponsor might say, you know what, there's a safety issue with the study, so we need to stop the study at this point. Or they might say, you know what, our funding has changed and we no longer could support it. So you want to put that in the consent form so people understand that there may be other reasons why the study might be stopped other than them either completing the study or them deciding to withdraw. And it's important, again, because this is an understanding. This is what I'm doing, this is what you're doing. We're going to let you know if anything changes. We think the study is going to go full force, but if it's not, we want you to know that we could stop it for these following reasons. If there's a cost to the participant, time, of course, is one cost. You know, we're going to ask you to come in 10 times over the next 3 months, and so it's going to take this much time. That's considered a cost, as well as a financial cost. A lot of our studies, you have to be enrolled in treatment as well in order to be in the research study. That's going to be a cost. If for some reason usually research is not billed to medical insurance, but if there's some secondary cost that they need to be aware of, that needs to be shared. You also need to tell them that if we find out anything about the study, or if we decide there's always data safety monitoring boards looking at all studies that are happening as well as IRBs, they might come down and say, you know what, we discovered that this drug isn't safe. We need to tell people that there's an increased risk of heart attack with taking this medication. Or if we discover that the medication is so good that there's no reason to go on with this clinical trial. So you need to tell them that if we find out any new findings, we're going to let you know about that. Of course, they can withdraw, and then, of course, I mentioned how many participants are taking place. Is this just a little study that 8 people are, or is there going to be 1,000 people across the country participating in it? All that's valuable information. So the next element of the informed consent process is comprehension, and we've talked about this a little bit with the consent forms need to be written in a way that everyone can understand them. Everyone, usually the standard is either sixth grade or 8th grade, but your IRB will determine that. And a lot of times that can be done by reducing words and sentences and so forth. And this isn't how to write a consent form, but this is why the consent forms are written this way. Things need to be done in lay language. You know, fancy medical research language impresses a lot of people, but it also really makes it so people don't understand what the heck is going on.
Lynn, this is Jennifer. I've just had an emergency, and I got to go.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, bye.
And so, okay. So we talked about quizzes, and so, and we talked about this in great length a couple of minutes ago about some IRBs and some institutions require quizzes. So, you know, to make sure that people understand. Again, as I mentioned, if there's no quiz, or even if there is a quiz, you know, take a couple of minutes, ask questions, make sure they understand. And then avoid therapeutic misconception. And this is a really difficult thing, especially in the clinical trials. Research goals and treatment goals are different, even though they seem to be the same, which means that we want people to abstain, we want people to stay in treatment, we want people to not, you know, to be in recovery and so forth. The research goals, what we're doing, for instance, in the START study, what we're doing is we're looking at liver toxicity. How is buprenorphine affecting the liver? How is compared to methadone? It is not a treatment approach. It is research, and you got to really tease those apart. And a lot of people think that research is treatment, and you got to pull those apart. I wish Jennifer were here to comment on that. The third thing is voluntary participation. We've talked a lot about this. We do not want to influence people to think that they have to participate in order to get good treatment, that this is the best thing out there right now, so you have to do it. You don't want to be inappropriate. You don't want to outweigh the benefits. We're going to give you $1,000 to participate in the study. That's really going to coerce people into participating that may not have participated under other circumstances. You don't want to put people in a position where we talked about the subordinate thing earlier as far as, I'm your boss, I want you to participate. And that's, so we don't want to put people, and we really want to talk and have that fair, this is your choice, this is your decision whether or not you participate. You can go into treatment other than that, but this is what's going to happen. And then, of course, the signed consent form, it's not a contract, as we talked about earlier. It's voluntary. You can withdraw at any time. You can refuse to answer one question, even if you don't like, if you want to participate in everything, but it's their choice to not answer such and such question. And you've got to make sure that people understand that. So, and then, of course, the sentence at the bottom, ethical practice and research protects the study staff, the investigator, and the participant. And as what we talked about earlier, it protects the integrity of research, and it protects the integrity of the advancement of medical technologies and medicines and treatments, and it's really the basis of how our society at large moves, and we need to keep those ethical principles at the top of our minds in order to help further the efforts of research. Now, we talked a little bit about vulnerable and special populations, and they actually have separate, additional Code of Federal Regulations around them, and we talked about children. And the children have to access as well as have a parent or someone consent so they understand what's happening. So the parent can't just come in and say, yeah, my kid's going to participate. My 12-year-old is going to participate in this study. We have to, at some point, assent them in the sense of letting them know also what's going to happen and allow them to have a choice as well as the parent about whether they participate. Pregnant women, we can't focus in on pregnant women, fetuses, and neonates. There's special regulations about how to deal with them. Prisoners, it's mandatory to be voluntary. A lot of times IRBs require a prisoner advocate on board when they review the protocol to make sure that all the rights of the prisoners are being thought about and appreciated and respected. There is a level of additional approval for research related to prisoners, and that goes through OHRP, and some of our studies have done it and others haven't, but there is an extra layer because they used to be used as the guinea pigs of research, so to speak. Of course, cognitively impaired, people that can't make those choices, and then substance abuse, homelessness, elderly, others that might fall into that decisionally impaired group. And there's additional CRS related to them. Now, we do, in the clinical trial, substance abuse research, and that's where a lot of our IRBs come into play and additional regulations with how to write a consent form. Hey, Liz, if you want to jump in and provide some insight as well since Jennifer's gone, that would be wonderful.
I have my mute button pushed. I think you did just great. I just got a message from Jen. There was a tornado near her son's camp, so she needed to jump off and make sure everything was okay. So we will all wish her the best. We'll move on to our polling question. This is just to make sure that you all understand the mandatory elements of informed consent. If you want to go ahead and make your selection. Okay, Lynn, I'll go ahead and go back to the PowerPoint.
All right, so good job, everyone. Listen to me babble. The correct answer is information comprehension and voluntariness. Yes. So again, information providing individuals with all the necessary elements so they understand what they're getting into. Comprehension, providing them information in a way that they understand it and that they're able to digest it and make an informed decision. And then, of course, that their participation is completely voluntary. So.
Okay, then we'll move ahead with Lesson 4, the essence of informed consent. You want to go ahead and take this over for Jen?
Sure. So everyone will have to be a little bit patient with me because I did not prepare as much on this one because Jen was going to present this. So the real question comes about who does the consenting. You know, there's a huge research staff at all the places, and there's some debate and there's some discussion about who it is that does the consenting in our studies. The best person to do consenting is the person who is most knowledgeable about the research. So the PIs write the project, they know things, they of course consent, as well as site coordinators. But RAs and those that are really on the front line should be the ones that consent. They understand the process. You need to be able to talk about the different alternatives, so forth, and you need to be able to answer the questions, field questions that they have, that the participant might have, and or be able to look for a resource to be able to do consenting. So it's not advised to have receptionists that aren't involved in studies and so forth do consenting. You really want somebody that knows the study front and back. It's really important where you do informed consent because you don't want the person to be distracted. You don't want them to feel like they can't ask a question because they're embarrassed that so-and-so will hear them down the hall. So you want to be in a private place where you can talk freely and where you don't feel rushed or pressured for time because you want it to take as much time as it's going to take. Some people read the stuff, understand it immediately. Sometimes it takes an hour. They want to talk about it, they want to process it, they want to understand the mandatory reporting, they want to understand that. So the other thing when you're scheduling informed consent is you want to think about that. You want to say, what is the average time that it's going to take? It'll take me about 10 minutes, but I can see how it might take somebody else an hour, so I'm probably going to schedule that hour just to make sure that everybody is comfortable and so we're not pressured for time. And that actually speaks to when you're talking with people about informed consent. You want to make sure that you don't rush them, that you tell them that we'll take as much time as you need. So, as that says, and you want to respect and be patient with them and not say, come on, we've already talked about this. You really want it to be a process that everyone is comfortable with and not feel pressured for time. We talked about this earlier. It's really it's an opportunity. It's that first time that you're talking with those people at length. And you're going to have a relationship with participants for as long as the study, potentially even further than that. And so you want to build that rapport relationship where they can be honest with you, where they can be open with you, and where you can do the same, and where you seem to be approachable and you seem to be knowledgeable. That's one of the most important things. If you're just sitting there and you go, well, I don't know, how are they going to trust that they're in good hands, so to speak, and that their well-being is really being outlooked? If you don't know about the study, if you don't understand about the medication, if you don't understand about the procedures that are going to be taking place, you want to relay to them your confidence that you're in good hands. This is a good study. This is really worthwhile, and I understand what's going to happen. And if I don't, you know what? We're going to figure it out together. That kind of a thing. You also, the better rapport you build at that first onset of informed consenting, they'll feel better about coming back, they'll feel better about calling you and missed appointments, rescheduling, the whole process. It really sets kind of the tone for their participation in the study. And as we talked about a lot, it's an agreement between the researchers and the participants. The common challenges is, providing an environment where they're not intimidated, that they feel like they have to participate, that they can't ask questions, that, oh God, if I don't go into the study, my counselor's going to see me and then she's going to report to my PO that I'm being a pain. Those kind of things. You want to try to alleviate those kind of concerns with it. Understanding, assessing, being aware of what's happening with the participant themselves. Do they seem fidgety, other than in the withdrawal perspective, obviously, but do they seem like they really want to be there and they really want to be part of the study, or do they seem like somebody's pushing them into it? Not just yourself, but there might be a third-party person that's pushing them into it. One of the most important things, besides having the open dialogue, recognizing that consenting that is a process, is making sure that you have accurate documentation of the consent process. And so what you want to do is you want to have that document signed, appropriately signed. I'm not sure if the next, here we think. You want to have them sign it, you want to have them date it. You want to make sure you look at that after they hand it to you to make sure that they signed it and to make sure that they date it, because it doesn't make it, you have to go back and get them to date it if otherwise, and then you have to make a little note about why it's post-dated and so forth. As well as when you're signing it, sometimes consent forms require the person who's obtaining consent to sign it. You want to make sure that the participant knows that they can have a copy of it. Some places will require you to give them a copy. Others will just say that you offer it to them. Make sure that. So that way they walk away with that piece of paper that they understand what's happening with them. Make sure you file that consent form in there, and then possibly, in our node, we make people make a note in the progress reports about the participant was consented, seemed as if, they presented, they asked some very good questions, we answered the questions, we had a discussion, they signed the consent form on such and such date. And so there's not just a signed document that says that they sent it, but you're acknowledging it by writing a progress report.
And pardon the interruption, Ms. Kunkel, we do have a question in the queue.
Oh.
Would you like to take it?
I think that's Jennifer.
No, actually, Ms. Potter is online also, but we do have a participant waiting to ask a question.
Okay, can you star one on?
Yes, ma'am. Just one moment.
Caller, I'm back, Jennifer.
Jennifer, you're back?
This is Linda in Roseburg.
Hi, Linda.
One of the things that we did is Lynn McCracken had suggested sending out the consent prior to the participant coming in for their baseline assessment. And we have found that this really helps them because sometimes when they come in, they're very anxious and worried and concerned, and it gives them the comfort of their own home to go over it and write down their questions. And we have found that since then, we seem to be getting better questions and they're a little more at ease during the process. And I had wanted to volunteer that earlier, but here it is now.
Oh, thank you so much, Linda. That is an excellent idea. Sometimes you'll want to run that by your IRB just to make sure that they don't have any problems with that. But that is a wonderful idea. They can come in with questions. Sometimes they will not have looked at it, but at least it's provided them with that opportunity. Thank you, Linda. Jen, did I hear you say you come back? Oh, I guess not. Okay.
But everything's okay now. So, just one thing about that example that Linda gave. I think it's a great idea. One thing to think about as you're deciding to do that is the nature of the study, because in some instances, if it's particularly complex, or you want to ensure that people really understand the risks and benefits before they make a decision, you want to just really think about whether sending it to them beforehand is going to have implications for them being able to actually come in and talk with you about the information. In other words, if they read it and they're not interested and therefore they don't come in, you've missed that opportunity to have a conversation, and that can have an impact on your recruitment goals. So just think about that logistically. It's a good thing to think about when you're deciding to do that.
Good, yes. Thank you, Linda, though, for that suggestion. Does anybody else have other suggestions related to obtaining informed consent?
Once again, that is *1.
Okay. So just quickly, things to remember. Ample time we talked about. Make sure that you get all the necessary signatures. Make sure that if the form says that investigator needs to sign it, that you do. Make sure that you're using the most updated, approved consent form by the IRB. This can be kind of tricky because consent forms look alike. Try to make sure that there's a version control. Before a participant comes in, check in if you have access to your IRB records to make sure that it's the most recent version. As well as sometimes people sites color coordinate consent forms, so you know, oh yeah, I'm supposed to use the blue one now because the yellow one expired last week or had additional changes or so forth. And so think about whatever works for your site as far as whatever you need to do to have version control with consent forms. Make sure that whatever version you're using has been IRB approved. As always, with all documentations, make sure that you use the correct procedure for corrections, and make sure, unless you have gotten approval for doing pre-screening, which means before consent form, do not collect any study data prior to obtaining consent. Again, with the caveat that if you have IRB approval to collect certain things, you can do that. But for the most part, always fall on the I cannot collect any study data prior to consent. And remember that a signed consent form is not a contract. Okay, so unless anybody has any, Jen, unless you have another comment, or we'll go on to the lesson 4 polling question.
And Pardon the interruption. We do have a question in the queue.
Great.
Caller, your line is open.
Lynn, hi. This is Paul Joachim.
Hi, Paul.
Hi. So the informed consent is signed, or you go through the process before the eligibility criteria?
That's correct.
So it's really like the very first step, or very close to the first step.
That's very true. Sometimes some sites will have pre-screening items that have been pre-approved by the lead node as well as the local IRB that they'll be able to obtain. But beyond that, it is absolutely the first one. And that's why when you're looking at reports, you'll see how many people are enrolled or consented into the study, and that might be 97, but how many people actually were inducted or randomized or 27, that kind of a thing. There might be that discretion because people might go through the consenting process and then discover that they're not eligible.
Thank you.
And in some places, the one area where I've seen this get a little tricky is with breathalyzing. And so there are places where I've seen breathalyzer come before consent with the idea that they need to be competent, and in other places I've seen consent form, then breathalyze. If it's positive, then reconsent. And so it's just an example of this stuff can be tricky. And that's why it's important that IRB review process and that you describe your procedures clearly, because your IRB will provide you with guidance with that. But that's one thing I've seen where if you are a site that needs breathalyzer before you can consent or after you can consent, that can get a little confusing.
Yes. So it goes back to really check in with your IRB and make sure that everyone on your study team knows what has been approved by the IRB as far as these processes.
Okay, let's move ahead with our polling questions. Out of the options provided, which is the best way to discuss and obtain consent? In the investigator's office right before the study procedures have to begin, in a quiet room where the potential participant can ask questions and take the consent document home for further consideration, or in a room with the entire research team present and ready to discuss the study and answer questions about the consent form.
Okay, it looks like, do we have another question, or is this the only one for this section, Liz?
We have one more question I'll present. All of the following are key ethical requirements for clinical research, except the methodology used in the research should be scientifically sound. There should be favorable risk-benefit ratio for individual subjects. Subjects should be paid for their participation in a protocol, and IRB should review the research protocol. Now the object here is to point out the exception to the key ethical requirements for clinical research. Okay. Lynn, Jen, are you ready to go back?
Sure.
Okay.
All right. Which is the best way to obtain consent? In a quiet room where both the person obtaining consent and the potential participant can sit down and discuss the consent. That's correct. Now, if that so happens to be in the investigator's office before the study procedures begin, that's okay, but the ideal is in a quiet place where you guys can have these discussions. All right, and of all of the following are key ethical requirements. Subjects should be paid for their participation in the protocol. A lot of times they are compensated for their time, but it is not something that is a requirement for clinical research. And again, they should be told whether or not they're going to receive any sort of compensation for their time and efforts. All right, Jen, do you want to do some of the case studies?
Jump in as
you see fit, okay? Okay, so what we wanted to do was go through some case studies, just a couple of them, and the idea is to just, there's not always a right or wrong answer in many situations, but the idea is to just see the types of ways that folks might respond to these particular situations. So let me cue this up. Okay, and again, note that some of these might not necessarily be applicable to a CTN study that as currently is, but they're still highlighting examples of situations that come up with informed consent. So in this particular case, the consent is to be obtained by a licensed MD only, and in many of our institutions, particularly hospitals, it's required that informed consent, the document is signed and witnessed by a licensed MD. How that process happens can be variable. The research team in this particular case knows these subjects well, and the coordinators consent to subjects, but they don't sign the consent form. And this is complying with, this is an internal document here at Partners Healthcare, so ignore that. But the coordinators sign the consent to subjects, but don't sign the consent form. Subjects are asked if they wish to speak with the PI, and most subjects decline. The PI or a co-investigator provides their signature on the consent form. And then subsequently the study is amended and requires subject reconsent. So let's think about some of the issues here. And what I'm going to ask is, unfortunately, because of the way that this call is set up, we can't open all of the phone lines and have a discussion. But I really would like to get people's insight. I've heard of a few people speak up and ask questions. Linda, if I pick on you again, that would be terrific. But what we'd like to know is some of your thoughts. So, for example, in this case study, does the licensed MD signature on the consent form comply with the institutional policy, and what does the signature represent? Any thoughts on that?
Again, that is *1. And there's no one in the queue at this time.
Okay, Lynn, you want to be my counterpoint here?
Sure. So what was the question?
So I guess what I'm thinking is the best way to use these case studies, given we can't have a full roundtable discussion on them, is to just think of what the issues are that come up. So in this particular case, there's an issue about a licensed MD signing on the consent form to comply with the policy. But what does the signature represent in this particular situation?
Well, I think that, and we're talking about the signature on the consent form. Okay. I think that the MD has said that they acknowledge that the participant has read the consent form and understands the process. So now the complexity lies in, was the MD really there or not?
Right, and so that's a policy decision at the institution. So, I mean, what do you think about? Again, I'm not looking for right or wrong answers. I'm just what are the issues that we're looking at as we think about this particular case?
Well, the issues are is who actually obtained the consent, making sure that you have documentation of that and what the consenting means. And so what I would say with my local team here is that I would expect to see a progress note written by the person who actually obtained the consent saying, I reviewed the consent form with participant on such and such day. We reviewed questions, so forth. As per protocol guidelines and IRB guidelines, we had the participant sign the consent on such and such day. After which, I took the consent form to Dr. Hosey, and he signed it on such and such day. So you're acknowledging that you are the one that obtained the consent, and how you obtained the consent, and that you were following the protocol procedures by then having the document. And so that way the progress note indicates that the MD wasn't really there at the time of consenting, but that you were there, that kind of a thing. Is that what you're looking for, Jennifer?
Yeah, and again, I hate to say this, but there weren't any right or wrong answers. It was looking at the issues related to informed consent that are raised. So I guess the issue for me is that if the PI isn't there, what does the signature represent? And it seems to me it's exactly what you're saying, that there's the standard operating procedure is that the signature of the MD represents that his or her team consented according to procedures, and they're in compliance with the study, and that each participant has the opportunity to speak with the PI. I guess the flip side that I react to in this is that why there's something funky to me about subjects are asked if they wish to speak to the PI, and most subjects decline. I'm not particularly surprised by the fact that most subjects decline. If you offer someone something, it's very different than saying, now this is the part of the consent process where you're going to talk with the PI. Something that we do here for any of our drug trials is that most of the informed consent process takes place with our research assistants. Our institution does not require an MD sign the consent form, but we have decided internally that when any drug study is taking place, that they have what's called a physician visit. And in that visit, the physician that sees them gives them an opportunity to ask questions, to talk about the risks and benefits specific to the medication. And so in some ways, we want to make sure that they have a chance to talk to a licensed clinician about the medication or the investigational drug in the trial, but it's certainly not requiring a signature. But we don't give them the choice because the thought with the choice is that most people are going to say no because they're trying to be polite. So, okay, let's see if there's anything else in here we want to pop. I think we'll go on from there. Okay, so let's look at the second case here. This is another on informed consent documentation. In this particular case, it's not a trial. The subjects are aged 18 to 25 and don't live in college campuses or dorms, so they're living on their own or with a family member. The study is of a sensitive nature because it's asking about sexual habits. So let's imagine this is a study about sexual risk behaviors related to STD transmission. The majority of subjects are not taking their consent form copy with them as required. So in this particular institution, they must take their consent form with them, and that's part of the policy is that they want to make sure that people leave with their consent form. And the copy not taken by the subject is being filed with the original. So what's the problem with them not taking their consent form with them as required? Or what issue does that raise?
Again, please press star 1 at this time.
Yeah, this is a difficult format to do this. Lynn, any thoughts that come to mind on this one?
Well, I think that again, I'm going to rely on the progress note issue too, is that you make the copy and you hand it to them. And what they do with it at that point is, once they get the obtained copy, it's all good, in your eyes. I mean, you've followed the requirements. If you're not giving it to them, you need to change your process, obviously, in order to make that part of the everyday process of the consenting. And again, I think that if you know that they haven't taken it, you've offered it to them, they refuse to take it for whatever reason, you make note of that. And you use those progress notes to say why it is that you're doing something different that is required of the informed consent process. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Lynn. And so one of the things to consider is why, in this case, a subject might not want to take a copy of their consent form. And in this particular case, taking home a consent form into their sexual topics can be uncomfortable for people to talk about, or they might be embarrassed to bring it home because somebody might find it. I do think that, from my perspective, as Lynn was mentioning, I think it makes sense for the site to keep the copy on file if the subject refuses, so that they have it on hand and they can document, as Lynn mentioned, that they did offer it to them. I think, some of this is what is the next step to rectify the problem. And I think this really points out a process about informed consent. If you're supposed to be following a procedure and the procedure isn't working, one of the things to do is not just assume that, well, they don't take it, so I'm just going to file it and let it go away. That's kind of an independent decision. I think what the best process in a situation like this to do is to say, we've got this procedure, we're supposed to give these people the consent forms and no one takes them. Can we raise that at a staff meeting, or can I bring that to MFPI and talk a little bit about it? Because I think as a team, you might be able to identify a way to have a process in place that people are actually following, or you can talk to your IRB about whether they have any concerns about the fact that the site, the participants aren't taking this document with them. Is this study important enough that you need to alter your processes to encourage this? And so, the takeaway message for both of these situations that, we've brushed on a couple times, but I think is important, is that anytime there's an issue or a situation that comes up in informed consent, that I call it tickles the back of my neck, where it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like you're following the procedures that you're supposed to, or there's something that just doesn't seem right, whether it's with an individual consent process or the procedures overall. I think it's really important to take that back to the other people on your team. So if you're an RA and there's a study coordinator, bring it to the study coordinator. If you're a coordinator and you're reporting to the PI, bring it to the site PI and bring up and have a dialogue about this. And when you do that, you're exercising due diligence around raising these issues, identifying potential problems, vetting them to see if it's a significant enough problem that warrants some adjustment, and then making an adjustment as it seems appropriate. I think where problems occur is when we recognize that there's an issue or something that doesn't feel right, we don't say anything, and then heaven forbid something happens down the road. So bringing these things into the light, taking them out of the closet, discussing them, and drawing them to resolution rather than just accepting that, oh, people never take the consent forms is the best way to do it. Because at the end of the day, maybe it isn't that big a deal that they don't take the consent form, but if they're not following a procedure that your institution feels is important, it's worth discussing it. Anything to add to that, Lynn?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Pardon the interruption. We do have a question in
Sure.
queue. Caller, please go ahead.
Okay. I need to research the new RA at the McLean site.
Hi, is it Susan?
This is Susan.
Hi, Susan. I'm so
Hi.
glad you spoke up.
So this might be a very obvious question that I just am missing. But perhaps, like, if the reason in this case study somebody didn't take home the consent form is because of revealing information on it about what the medication is, perhaps this medication for an STI or something.
Mm-hmm.
Would there be, but I guess the point of taking it home is to consider and make it a process rather than a document so that the participant can contemplate it. Is there any form that wouldn't have identifying features about the medication itself, to say the study medication, or for, you know, the infection under study or something like that, with more vague terms that the subject could take home, or would that be more confusing?
Well, I think you're right on track with the type of thinking that you want to look at. So if the reason, because you're absolutely right, the reason we like people to take the consent form is that then they have that as a reference tool for them that we can either draw them back to or that they can check as they see fit moving forward. And it's just good when people sign something to have them take it with them. So that's absolutely right. And it does highlight that informed consent process, as you said. I think you're onto something when you're looking at the idea of, is there any way to make the consent form more protective of their privacy? I think it's challenging, and I like what you're thinking, because I like the idea of it's almost like, I think what you were describing was almost de-identifying the function of the medication in some ways, but still carrying the bulk of the important information that they need to know about it. And that can be a little tricky, but I think it's an interesting idea, and that's the type of idea that you want to bring forward as part of a team to talk about, because maybe there are ways to limit the information or manage the information. So yeah, no, I think that's great. It wouldn't necessarily get through an IRB, but I think it's a good idea, and it speaks to this process of trying to solve problems rather than and overcome them rather than just accepting them.
Yeah, I didn't mean in place of a more detailed consent form, but perhaps if someone didn't want to take one, you could offer them a de-identifying form.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, and that's quite possible. Yep, the other thing, actually, one of the things that you remind me of is Lynn Kunkel, who's also on the call, has a really nice visual aid that she's developed for some studies, and we actually asked her to develop one for CTN 30 for us, and it's not going to get at all the details of the study drug, but it is going to help people to understand what to expect in terms of visits and coming back to the program and things like that. And it's a flowchart document. And as I'm thinking about it, Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't looked at it in a while, but I don't think there's any particular information in there that would identify those folks as having an opioid addiction, but what it does tell them is what to expect moving forward, that you're going to have to do this, that we're going to have you come back this many times for this health project.
Exactly, yeah, no, it's not that specific, and actually you can pretty much change the wording to be whatever you want it to be, but it does just lay out the amount of visits and how it's randomized and all those kind of things, you know.
Yeah, that also reminds me, Susan, on appointment cards and other things, it's always, you know, different programs do it slightly differently, but most people have some de-identified verbiage that they use, like, thank you for calling the health project or the health study or the project and things like that. And it's the same idea, so you're definitely onto the right idea with that. Thanks.
And there are no further questions.
Okay. So just to summarize, do you want me to do this one or do you want to?
Go ahead.
Okay. Just to summarize, what we went through today was a basic general overview of informed consent that, again, I think you guys clearly are getting this, that this is a process of information exchange that also includes a document that provides information needed for a participant to make an informed, educated decision, understanding all of the risks and benefits of a project, and a guide for discussion and explanation, and that this discussion includes information that you feel is important for them to be able to understand it, whether or not they may fully appreciate the importance of the information. Significant historical events were reviewed that were prompting, that demonstrated the importance and necessity of ethical principles in medical research. We talked about two key principles, the Belmont Report and respect for persons, autonomy, beneficence, and justice. And then Lynn did a very nice, extensive explanation of the key elements of information that need to be contained in an informed consent document, as well as the importance of how we deliver this information and communicate it and assess whether someone actually understands it and comprehension, and the importance of voluntariness in the research endeavors that we do. And then finally, we talked about the essence of informed consent as respect for persons, providing continuous information, and the importance of avoiding coercive statements and conduct. And I think just one final thought, I had to step away for a little bit, but about coercive statements is we walk a very fine line. I mean, the folks who presented recruitment and retention a few weeks ago are now presenting informed consent. And I know that at our site, for example, people, I think, feel a lot of pressure to recruit because that's what we do. We recruit research subjects and we run them through trials. At the same time, it's really important that we never cross that fine line into coercion or a sales job. I mean, we are not salespeople. We don't sell a study so that a participant will buy it. We present them with information. We do it as positively and enthusiastically as possible, but we always end up presenting information out of which an individual can make an informed decision about their willingness to participate. And I encourage all of you, it's tricky as a junior researcher sometimes to feel comfortable talking to more senior researchers, particularly your PIs and your coordinators. And it's really important to have those discussions. If you're doing something that feels uncomfortable to you, talk it out. Many times they might have some really good reasons to talk with you about it that feel very good to you, and you're able to go and do your work and continue to do it as you were doing it. But sometimes you bring something to light that investigator or senior person has not thought of, and we're all responsible, and it goes back to that issue that we're all responsible for conducting ethical research. And so we all have to feel very comfortable with what we're doing, and when we don't, we need to talk about it with our team and understand what's going on and either alter it or feel better about what we're doing when we do it. Lynn, your final comments?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just support everything that you said, obviously, and that I think that, I mean, we've just spent 2 hours talking about informed consent. I think it's something that we tend to forget about the importance of. And I would just encourage everyone the next time you're consenting someone to just take a deep breath and say, you know what? How would I feel on the other shoe, and what information would I want, and how would I want this to happen, and what's going to be best for everyone, the person, myself, the research, the integrity of medicine, all those kind of things. Look at the big picture of it. So that's my final word.
Liz, we're back to you.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much. I'm going to go ahead and put up the slide that tells you about the handouts and resources. We sent as part of the invitation and the handouts a Journal of Medical Ethics article, which has some important information in there, or interesting information. And Jennifer can you talk a little bit about your resources on informed consent?
My resources on informed consent.
Annotated compendium on NIH resources on informed consent. It's a huge document with lots of resources available to get more information on informed consent. So go ahead and check that out. We also provided a checklist, and it's available at the link that's provided for you on the screen. There's links here for further information on OHRP, the Belmont Report, and the Nuremberg War Crimes. So I also want to bring everybody's attention to the fact that we have a training coming up on IRB and regulatory documentation next week. And you guys can expect to get a follow-up email from me providing a link to provide a training evaluation. This is a new process. It's much more convenient than the previous process. It's all done online, so you don't have to get up or fax anything. So there's lots of opportunities for comments, and we welcome them, and we truly appreciate them. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming out and participating in this web seminar. And Lynn and Jen, thanks very much once again for your contributions to this web seminar.
Liz, I understand what you were saying. I'm sorry, I had a senior moment there. Do you want me to send you those documents so that we can distribute them to people, that annotated compendium?
No, we distributed the documents.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure that you didn't want to give some further explanations, but I think it's pretty safe to say that they explain themselves. It was a pretty comprehensive document. Okay, everybody, we are all done. If anybody has any last-minute questions, go ahead and press *1. Jen or Lynn, did you have any closing comments you'd like to provide?
I don't. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us, and we really would appreciate any sort of feedback that you have.
All right, everybody, you have a great afternoon. Thanks for participating.
Thanks. Bye.
And with no questions, that does conclude our conference for today. Thank you again for your participation, and have a wonderful day.
Liz, are you still on?
I am still on. You want me to call you back?
Yeah.